Okay, okay, we'll get rolling here. So thanks very much, Hugh and Sunny, for the invite, and thank you everyone who's kind of here to watch. I really appreciate it. So, kind of like if you can see the image here on the title screen, so kind of like this grower here has quite a daunting challenge ahead of him trying to harvest this corn that's overrun with giant ragweed, which is a weed that we don't have to deal with in Atlantic Canada, thankfully, as you can see. But just like he's kind of got a daunting challenge ahead of him, this title presents a daunting challenge for myself for today, because developing effective and durable weed management programs to kind of cover that in a way that would be applicable to the myriad of crops grown by, the myriad of people on this call. I mean, that's pretty much impossible to do. So what I kind of want to do today is I'm just going to talk about some things that I like to think about when thinking about weed management, and just kind of cover some concepts that will hopefully give you some ideas about things to think about, and maybe give you some ideas of some new things you might be able to try on your own farm. So I kind of want to cover five things today. So first, we'll kind of just have a quick look at sort of when the presence of weeds actually causes yield losses, because simply just because you see weeds in a crop at a given time doesn't actually mean you're actually at risk of yield loss. And I'll kind of expand on that here, obviously, shortly. If you take nothing else away from anything I say today, please take away some of the key mechanisms of weed seed dispersal that I'll talk about second, because this has become an extremely pertinent problem in modern agriculture with mechanization and the spread of herbicide-resistant weeds. Uh, and then I'll kind of look at some old faithfuls as well as some recent innovations in mechanical weed management that I think might have some applicability for Atlantic Canada. If you're going to try to talk about building durable, effective weed management programs, you kind of have to address the concept of cultural weed management as well. I mean, it's a tough one to pull off, but I do want to mention a few things about that concept that are kind of interesting and somewhat new to me in the research area, but maybe not so new to some of the folks on the call. And then we'll kind of have a run through of some of the common group numbers and products associated with pre-emergence, pre-emergence plus post-emergence, and post-emergence herbicide groups that are available for weed control, in a range of crops here in Atlantic Canada. So in terms of when the presence of weeds actually causes yield loss in a cropping system, most of the sort of data and scientific evidence for this comes from studies of weed interference in direct seeded annual cropping systems, to some extent transplanted annual cropping systems, and there's much less of this done with perennial crops. But weeds causing yield loss, it really depends on when the weeds show up relative to when the crop plants show up. So if we look at this simple diagram, on the y-axis is barley yield loss as a percent, so 0 to 50% yield loss. And then the x-axis here is relative time of weed emergence, and the numbers are a little strange because we have some negative numbers, a 0, and then some positive numbers. But what the negative numbers represent is the weeds getting a head start over the barley crop. So the weeds, in this case, wild oats, emerging 6 days before the barley, 4 days before the barley, and 2 days before the barley. The 0 represents the crop, barley, and the weeds, wild oat, emerging at the same time. And then the positive numbers refer to the crop plants emerging 2, 4, and 6 days after or before the actual weeds emerge. And so, in other words, the negative numbers is the weeds getting a head start, and the positive numbers is the crop plants getting a head start. And as you can see in this case, because it's over a relatively short time period, it's a relatively straight line, just a linear relationship. And the takeaway from this is that weeds that emerge before or with a crop obviously cause much greater yield losses than weeds that emerge in an emerged crop. And eventually, if you extend this out far enough to the right, you can eventually figure out when a crop plant has got a big enough head start that it will be immune to yield loss from weeds that emerge in that crop. And I'll kind of expand on that here shortly. Okay. And this tends to be more important than density. And so I know this figure is pretty lame looking figure. I totally understand that. But it conveys a very important point. And so similar to the last figure, the y-axis is your crop yield loss. The x-axis is your relative time of emergence, with weeds getting a head start, weeds and crops starting at the same time at 0, and then the crop plants getting a head start. But then it also adds weed density here on the z-axis here to make a surface response diagram. Don't worry about the weed species, it's irrelevant. But you can see the density goes from 0 up to 160. And so what I want you to kind of take away from this figure is just note that for any given weed density, the effect of that density of weeds on yield tends to be more severe the earlier those weeds emerge relative to when the crop emerges, and the effect of any given density on yield loss tends to decline as the weeds get less of a head start, and ultimately continues to decline as the crop plants begin to get a head start over the weeds. And another takeaway from this is if you kind of look at weeds emerging before versus after the crop, if you kind of look, say, right here at 40 weeds per square meter, when they're present 6 days ahead of the crop emergence, you're losing about 30% of your yield. And note that you jump all the way up to 160 weeds per square meter, but they're not present until 6 days after the crop emerges, and you're only losing roughly 10% of your yield. Okay, and so the point of that diagram and what you should take away from that diagram is that although it can look messy, in a lot of cases, the sheer amount of weeds present, although it is relevant in a certain sense, but it's more important to try to figure out when weeds emerged or when weeds showed up in a field relative to when the crop showed up or emerged within that situation, because a very small number of weeds present at the right time can cause a very big yield loss, whereas a large number of weeds present at the wrong time can have limited, if any, effect on yield loss. So it changes over time. Density is not really a reliable predictor of yield loss and interference in a lot of cropping systems. It is, but it's not. It is and it isn't, I guess, and I'll just leave it at that. It's really more of when the weeds are there relative to when the crop is there. And I think most folks are intuitively kind of know that crops are more susceptible to weed competition when they're young, and that makes perfect sense. But the key takeaway from this is you can give crops a big enough head start that they eventually will not lose yield to weeds, no matter how many emerge. And that concept has been extended to something that's a little more practical, which is what's referred to as the critical period for weed control. And that's the interval in the life cycle of any crop when weeds must be controlled to prevent unacceptable yield loss. And in most studies that determine a critical period for weed control, unacceptable yield loss is defined as 5% yield loss. But depending on how the study's done, you can develop critical periods for other percent yield losses as well. Okay. Now, I assume, sort of hope that some folks on the call would have heard of the critical period for weed control before. The way it's determined, and I want to show this because it will explain why you may not be able to find a critical period for weed control for some of the diversity of crops that are grown in Nova Scotia. And that's simply because it's very, very hard and expensive to figure out, because you have to do trials that kind of work like this. So the y-axis here has crop yield. The x-axis in this theoretical example, I'm just using straight time, so it's weeks after crop emergence. And then you have to grow a crop, across a very large area of a field and impose treatments on it. And the treatments are what are called the weed-free treatments, and then you have what are called the weed-infested treatments. In the weed-free treatments, the crop is kept weed-free until some point on the x-axis, say week X, and then weeds are allowed to emerge and grow with the crop for the rest of the growing season, and then you kind of get the yield. And so we'll fill in how this treatment tends to play out in most studies first. So in this case here, we're looking at week 1. So in this case, what's happened is the crop was kept weed-free until 1 week after the crop emerged, and then weeds were allowed to emerge in that crop, grow with it, and compete with it for the rest of the growing season. And as you might expect, in that situation, your crop yield is relatively low. Here's 2 and 3 weeks. So again, the crop was kept weed free until week 2 and until week 3. At that point, weed control was relaxed. Weeds were allowed to emerge, grow with the crop for the rest of the growing season. And again, you get, a relatively low yield. Okay. Now, eventually, things start to go like this, whereas the crop gets a progressively larger head start over the weeds, the line starts to curve upwards, and you eventually get a shape. In real life, it never works out as good as this. I'll show a real one in a moment. But you tend to get something that will kind of look like a sigmoid curve like this, and you can begin to get a sense of how much of a head start that crop is going to need over weeds to prevent an unacceptable yield loss. Okay. The opposite of those treatments is the weed infested treatments, and that's when the crop grows with weeds up until a point on the x-axis, and then the weeds are killed and kept out for the rest of the year. And so it tends to follow an opposite pattern. So in this case, the crop grew with weeds until 1 week after crop emergence, and then the weeds are killed and kept out for the rest of the growing season. And so the yield tends to be high, and then you can see the crop grows with weeds for 2 or 3 weeks after emergence, and then the weeds are killed and they're kept out. The yield also tends to be high. But eventually you will cross a threshold where if the crop's growing with weeds long enough during the initial stages of growth, you will eventually start to get a decline in your yield, and it will be representative of the longer the crop grows with weeds, the lower that yield will be at the end of the growing season. And you tend to get a line that tends to look like this. Now, hopefully you can see what the critical period for weed control would be for this hypothetical crop. You can pick it different ways, but if we kind of looked at this one, what I would take away is if weeds are present at 3 weeks after crop emergence, you're going to start losing yield. So weeds have to be removed by 3 weeks after crop emergence, and you have to keep them out until 10 weeks after crop emergence. And if you keep the crop weed free during that critical period, 3 to 10 weeks after emergence, you shouldn't lose you shouldn't lose any yield at all, theoretically, but you certainly should be less than 5% yield loss. Okay. The start of the critical period is almost meaningless or useless because most folks will already be doing some level of weed control, before, at, or around planting of a crop anyway. And so what I find most useful about the critical period for weed control is it tells you how big of a head start the crop needs until you don't have to worry about yield loss to weeds anymore. Okay, and so this is a real one here. Again, it always comes out dirty because this is done outside under real weather conditions and stuff, and you never get the same answer twice. But if you do Google this for a particular crop and you find diagrams, just understand they will be a little hard to interpret and they will not be nice and clean like my pretend one. And so what probably is best to look for is just look for the output from a critical period study, and that is simply how long you got to keep the weeds out to save your yield, and just get the numbers. And so they can be represented in a myriad of ways. Very common is simply a simple time measurement, such as weeks after planting, AP, weeks after emergence, AE, or weeks after transplanting, AT. What's more useful to me and less commonly available is if you can actually get the critical period for a crop provided as crop growth stages, because I think as most folks intuitively know, 1 week in June 2024 is not really analogous to 1 week in June 2025, for example, because we get different growing degree days and stuff. But if all you can get is a temporal scale, it does give you something to work with. And if you can get an actual crop growth stages, then that's your most reliable one across years, because it will factor in differences in growing seasons. And I'm not going to go through all of these. This will be in the recording. If there's a blank space, it's because I couldn't find that value for the critical period. But these are some common crops grown here in Atlantic Canada. And you can see the range of critical periods that are present for them. Competitive crops like corn, it tends to be relatively short. Potatoes is relatively short. Some of the more non-competitive crops like onions and carrots, the critical period tends to be quite long. For a lot of standard agronomic row crops, it's usually on average, probably 5 weeks after emergence. But again, it does vary. But I do encourage you to at least consider that, not blindly by any means, and I'll explain that in a second. But as the year goes on, and in some of the wet years that we've had over the last few summers where the rain just doesn't stop, that means the weeds don't tend to stop. But as the season goes on and you get, further and further out of that critical period for weed control, the presence of weeds is having less and less of an effect on yield until it has no effect at all. So even though it might not look appealing, just understand that you can at least use this information to understand when you've crossed the threshold for yield loss. And at least then that if you can't get back onto the land to deal with the late weeds or the weeds that keep coming, at least you've probably preserved your yield. Okay. Hey, now, again, I don't advise sort of following it blindly necessarily, because yield loss is what is taken into account by the critical period. It doesn't consider some of these other things. So if the presence of a weed is going to make it hard for you to harvest, or it's going to ruin some aspect of crop quality, then obviously you probably still want to try to manage it. If it's a vine, I would kill it without mercy, no matter how much of it is there, no matter when it is there. No mercy to vines, because they're a big problem no matter what kind of crop you're growing. And then obviously if weeds live to the end of the season and they reproduce, then you potentially have to deal with the progeny of those weeds in future years. Okay, but like I say, in some of the summers we have where the flushes of weeds just don't stop because it's just incessantly wet. At least if you know the critical period for weed control for your crop, you can at least know when you're safe from yield loss at a minimum. Okay, so hopefully that makes a little bit of sense. Now, kind of getting into some thoughts on kind of dealing with weeds with my little cartoon farm that I'm kind of embarrassed to have up there, but I couldn't get a better picture. But when it comes to dealing with any pests, and we'll keep it to weeds, the goal is to prevent first, failing that you eradicate, and then failing that you control, with prevention simply being stopping the introduction of a weed into a non-infested area, eradication referring to the destruction of all plants and plant parts present on a site, so that the weed cannot reestablish naturally on that site. It would have to be reintroduced to become reestablished. And then control is what we do for all the weeds that have long since been missed for opportunities for prevention and eradication. And that's just the ongoing suppression of weeds on a yearly basis to minimize any negative impacts. Okay, so what we spend most of our time doing with weed management is what we would call control, because the soil is already so full of weed seeds and other things, and you can't go back in time to stop them from getting there in the first place. Okay, so prevention and eradication, that really only applies to weeds you don't already have. And so for many folks, you might immediately thought, well, who cares? That might be 1% or something, but there are some doozy weeds on the move right now in North America. So I do want to talk a little bit about prevention, because there's some folks getting blindsided with some nasty weeds in different parts of Canada, including Eastern Canada, that are left with quite a mess to deal with after the fact. So when it comes to prevention, when you're dealing with weeds, obviously you got to prevent the movement of propagules, mainly seeds, but also vegetative propagules if you're dealing with a perennial weed. And you can also rely on larger policies like seed laws, weed laws, and things like that. I'm not going to get into that because that's the government's job. That's bigger than you or I as individuals, but we can have some control over the dispersal of weed seeds in the environment to some extent, and in particular onto the land that we may manage. Okay, so anytime I'm teaching a weeds course at the university, I always show students a diagram like this that outlines some of the common mechanisms of weed seed dispersal. There's distance in feet at the bottom. That's a little less relevant. I kind of like the top one here that I've added, which is within fields, and between regions. And obviously, if a bar, the length of the bar kind of tells you, how far that mechanism on the y-axis can disperse seeds. Anything with a red dot is something that we really can't control for the most part. And anything with a green dot are the ones that we do have, at least some control over. So for example, tillage equipment is going to have soil on it. Soil is full of weed seeds. The average square meter of farm soil contains billions of weed seeds. And so even a tablespoon of soil is full of weed seeds. So if you move soil, you inevitably move seeds of weeds with it. There's just no way around it. And you can also have obviously rhizomes, tubers of nutsedge and stuff can get caught in that stuff as well. Hey, the other big one that I just want to mention today, I'm not going to get into some of these other ones, but probably the key mechanism for weed seed movement in sort of North American cropping systems right now is by far harvesting equipment like combines. There's a lot of weeds moving on this type of machinery, and to be honest, with the exception of Canada fleabane, if anyone's familiar with that weed, most of the most common herbicide resistant weeds produce seeds that do not move in the wind. So lamb's quarters, pigweed, the ragweeds, etc. None of those weeds produce windborne seeds. The seeds just fall off the plant onto the ground if left alone. The way they move from one farm to another is on equipment that we move, and in particular, harvesting equipment like combines. Okay, so this was a study just with low bush blueberry pickers here back in the early 2000s, but you can see in 2006 and 2007, machines that were just parked waiting to start harvesting a field. In 2006, they had close to 400,000 weed seeds on them. And in 2007, they had close to 200,000 weed seeds on them. That would just fall off and start a new weed problem in the field. Okay, not happening right in our backyard, but very, very close. This weed here, water hemp, which is a very, very bad species of pigweed. In Canada, the two known initial introductions of it were in Ontario and Quebec. Ontario in the early 2000s, Quebec in 2017, so not that long ago. And in both cases, it was confirmed by the provincial extension folks that each introduction, which happened separately, but each one was caused by growers purchasing harvesting equipment from the southern US, where water hemp is a big problem, and then importing that equipment into Canada, and then starting to use that equipment on their own farms. And now those farmers are left with a very significant weed problem. And if anyone's familiar with water hemp, these pigweed or amaranthus species are incredible evolvers. And so most of them have multiple herbicide resistance. So they're resistant to, in some case, double-digit root numbers here. And they have cross resistance. They're extremely troublesome weeds to manage. And so the growers that bought this equipment and then brought the seeds in and then now have to live with that water hemp, there's no edit undo button for that. You can drive down to Texas and shoot the guy you bought it from if you want, but that doesn't change the situation. Just like when you get sick, you're the one that's sick and you have to deal with it no matter how you caught the cold. It's the same thing when you bring weed seeds onto your property or somebody else comes onto your property and brings them. That's really beside the point after the fact is that you have that problem to deal with. It ultimately it is yours to deal with. So be very, very careful about where you're purchasing equipment from, and make sure that if you do purchase it from regions that have known really bad weed problems, clean that equipment as best as you can before you use it. Okay. Hey, there are some nice fact sheets and extension material, mostly from the US, on how to clean and prevent weed seed distribution on things like combines. We've posted some information on blueberry pickers in the past. Um, there was a recent study done in Ontario looking at sweet potato slips and potential contamination with weeds. I know this is an important crop locally, and the folks that did that work, they were finding several pigweed species growing from soil and debris that was in those as well. So, if you do grow something like sweet potatoes and you plant a crop and you happen to notice something weird growing, just kill it. Don't even wait to identify it. Just destroy it and eradicate it so you don't even have to worry about it. Okay. Okay. I do my part as well as a researcher. So these are my feet covered in fescue seeds on a rainy day, walking through a blueberry field. And then this is a picture of Mike Cobra's boot. He's the weed extension person for Ontario, and he was doing some late season crop scouting and stopped and shared these pictures at one of the national weeds meeting, but said he just happened to stop to clean out his boots and noticed that there was a whole bunch of weed seeds in them. And you can see the species that he found, and they actually tested the pigweed seeds for resistance to several herbicides, and some of the seeds were carrying herbicide resistant genes as well. Um, and so the bottom line is these things do get around, and we are very good at moving them around. So just be aware of some of those dispersal mechanisms. And if you're able to try to clean equipment between fields, if you know you got a problematic weed, or if you're bringing equipment in that's used from a part of the country or the world that has certain problematic weeds, do be sure to keep in mind what might be kind of hiding on it when you bring it in. Okay. Right. Now, once a weed gets in, you're kind of left with, regardless of whether it's eradication or control, you're kind of drawing from the same toolbox there, and that's hand removal, physical, mechanical, cultural, and chemical. I'm not going to touch on biological control today because for most of us in agriculture, we're getting sort of limited mileage out of that for the most part. Now, just a couple comments on sort of hand removal. I know it's not something I enjoy. I like weeding my garden, but I don't want to weed 1,000 acres of carrots by hand or something like that. But I know many vegetable growers and things, hand weeding, is potentially an important part of an overall weed management program. For some folks growing Roundup Ready corn and soybeans as part of a dairy rotation or something, it's less so important or whatever. But the main point I want to make with it is, even if you have $1 million self-propelled sprayer or something sitting in the yard, never view hand removal as something that is potentially sort of below you, because it can still be, as a last resort, it can be a very beneficial sort of way to prevent a very bad problems in the future if you're able to sort of get access to the labor and things, and you can get the resources to get things done. So here, for example, this is down in Arkansas, which obviously is almost irrelevant to us, but the concept is important here. So this is a glyphosate or Roundup resistant pigweed here. It's Palmer amaranth in a cotton field here. And these weeds were noticed late in the growing season. I don't think they had confirmed that it was carrying resistant genes, but based on the herbicide program, it was strongly suspected that these pigweed plants were likely resistant to one or more of the herbicides used. if you find yourself in a situation like this where you've got large weeds that have survived, a fairly intense herbicide program, or at least a traditionally reliable herbicide program, your window for stopping them from producing seeds that are going to carry those genes into the next year and the year after and so on is very, very small at this point. You have literally almost no time to counter this, especially if flowers are starting to form. And so in this situation, you might be able to clip above the crop, but you're going to leave so many growing points behind that they're still going to go to seed. Weed wiping probably will give incomplete control depending on your height differential. And in a lot of cases, the safest bet to salvage this situation so your field is not completely full of this weed in the next year or two is to simply get them pulled and get them out of the field for disposal. That's one of the only surefire ways to ensure that you have minimal to no seed return to the seed bank in a situation like this, because there simply aren't a lot of sort of tractor driven tools that are going to turn this around fast enough for you to prevent that. With the exception of a new electric tool that I'll talk about here shortly, which wasn't available when this was happening, and the same thing here. So we grow a lot of carrots in Nova Scotia. Anybody who grows carrots knows that without Lorax, carrots would be a lot less fun to grow. And in Ontario, Lorax or Linuron is already starting to come up against it in terms of herbicide resistant weeds. And so this is hand crews pulling Linuron or Lorax resistant pigweed, go figures, pigweed, from the muck soil region there in Ontario, where they produce a lot of vegetable crops. And again, we're in a situation here where there really isn't much choice, because if this weed survives and reproduces, pigweeds like lamb's quarters, very large seed output. Once those resistant genes are in the seed bank, you're not going to be very long before spraying Linuron will be just like spraying water, and you're not going to be able to grow carrots there anymore unless you can find alternative weed control tools, right? So hand removal, again, I totally understand that it's something that a lot of folks wouldn't want to do, and I totally understand. I also understand that many folks may be relying on it as a key part of your day-to-day weed control. But even if you're not, it's a very useful way to turn a very bad situation around very quickly if you can get the labor to be able to do. It's also the best way to eradicate new weeds, because one or two weeds in a field, just hand pulling them and throwing them off a cliff can save you from having to get the tractor out to deal with a million of them in a year or two. Right? Now, physical, mechanical, this is a huge category with tons of choices in here. And actually, if you kind of follow the developments in pest management and weed management, there's more happening in terms of physical and mechanical weed control than any other category, to be honest. There's incredible tools being developed that fall under this umbrella. And I'm not going to touch on all of them today, and I'm not going to go down, because I spend probably 4 hours on this in the weeds course, and obviously we're not going to do that today. But I just wanted to highlight a few things that I found kind of interesting, that have kind of either always been there but kind of gotten forgot about, or are kind of starting to become a little bit more popular at present time. And so obviously, if you're under this umbrella, tillage is going to be, an important component here. I'm not going to go through primary, secondary tillage, all that stuff today. But what I kind of wanted to sort of remind folks of, and then show some newer things, is of the fact that even once a crop is up and growing, there are a range of inter-row, intra-row, and broadcast cultivators that many growers rely on to get almost complete weed control depending on the crop that's being grown. Now, controlling weeds between the crop rows or inter-row cultivation, that's low-hanging fruit. And I think most folks know that, and many folks would be aware of what a row cultivator is. You can drag whatever you want between the crop rows, a bag of doorknobs, a bunch of bricks. It doesn't matter as long as you're not hitting the crop plants. You can try to drag whatever you want down there as long as it'll kill the weeds. So that's pretty easy, and there's a range of tillage tools that will do that. The row cultivators probably the most economical and the most commonly used, but there are a range of other tools. But something it's new and it's not new because I think this idea has been around for a while, but just maybe not used that much. But this concept seems to be picking up steam in some of the organic farming systems in the US. And this is the idea of mowing between crop rows as opposed to cultivating between them and trying to use the weeds that are growing between the crop rows almost as a living mulch that you kind of keep mowed. Um, and this system, albeit it's been proven more successful when used in conjunction with herbicides, so in a more conventional sense, but I think it can still be useful in a sort of an organic sense as well. But this is a prototype that was developed in Manitoba and Canada. If you Google this, Artec Industries, you can get some more details on that. You can't just go and buy one of these things at Green Diamond, but there is a commercial manufacturer in the US. It's the Row Shaver, and it's a pretty interesting implement. You can raise it up to cut above the crop plants to get tall weeds. My opinion is that that's of limited utility, to be honest, because you still leave too many growing points behind. But this is just a quick video just to kind of see this thing kind of mowing between some crop rows here and in a no-till system that they're trying to do organically. And it's just, I think it's kind of a neat idea. This idea of kind of mowing between the crop rows like this, using the weeds as a natural living mulch. They're going to be there anyway. So kind of using them that way and then kind of keeping them clipped back, like you kind of see here. And it's kind of a cool looking. I have no idea what it costs. But the concept does seem to be pretty interesting. And there are some folks that are making this work as part of overall sort of no-till farming. Hey, if you're interested, you can look up that commercial one. In the US, there's this Sustainable Agriculture Research and Education sort of group. I highly recommend them. YouTube videos that they have, interviews with farmers about what they're doing for weed control, is invaluable, is very interesting. And you can kind of Google this, but this was a project they supported for a farmer to develop his own inter-row crop mower. And so you can see how it's built. That's the point I'm trying to make here. You can make your own, potentially if you can get the parts, and this kind of outlines, how you might be able to do that. And there's some work done. It's kind of started in the early 2000s, by this researcher, William Donald, down in the US. But you can see here, pre-emergence banded herbicides followed by only one between row mowing controls weeds and corn. And to date, at least from a research perspective, that's how this has been most successful, is either, you grow a Roundup ready crop, you just band apply the Roundup over the crop row and then mow between the crop rows to reduce your herbicide use. But you can also use other herbicide products if you want to, or you could use some intra-row cultivators that I'll mention here next to supplement the mowing if you want to. But I think it's just kind of a neat concept, and I think when I first started studying weeds years ago, the idea that you'd be running a mower down through a cornfield would never have occurred to me in a million years. Now, getting weeds that are growing between the crop rows is pretty easy, but getting weeds that grow in the crop row right up next to the crop plants, that's more challenging to do in the absence of something like chemical weed control. But one of the more successful implements that I hear more and more positive things about, and some negative things as well, but more and more positive things about is a finger weeder. And I imagine some folks are familiar with these, some folks may not be, but they're designed almost like the cogs in a machine to kind of work the soil in around crop plants to basically pull that out and rough that up so that they uproot small seedlings. And so here you can see this image of finger weeder running. It's got sweeps ahead of it. If the soil's crusty like this, they don't tend to work as well. But this one's just got little sweeps running ahead of it to break that soil crust to allow it to work. And you can see where it's been worked by the finger weeder versus where it hasn't. And here you got a finger weeder working in the row and a row cultivator working between the row to give you potentially, 90% plus weed control in that situation. And I love watching videos of finger weeders working. It's very, very hypnotic to see these working. Of course, I want to show them. But it's pretty phenomenal the mileage you can get out of this relatively simple implement in a range of crops. So we won't watch this whole thing, but just give you a sense to see, how they. Oh, I think you get the idea. Obviously, like any cultivation based tool, it's paramount that you drive straight in order to avoid the crop damage. But I don't have any information on it in here, but um, as many folks are aware, in the precision agriculture realm, a lot of work is being done on targeting pesticide applications for, site specific applications and stuff. But the same technology is equally advanced on cultivation equipment as well. So things like finger weeders, other cultivators do exist now with the cameras, the machine vision, and so on that will allow the implements to avoid crop plants and only target weed plants as well. Okay. Now, the last sort of category of tillage implements I just wanted to mention is I call them broadcast cultivators. Other folks might call them blind cultivators. The tine weeder is one of them, but the one I like the most and that seems the most interesting and effective is this thing here's the rotary hoe. Hopefully, some folks are familiar with it, and hopefully, there's some folks using it. It's kind of old technology, but it tends to be very effective once you've got the wrinkles worked out and you know how to time it properly with the crop that you're growing. But it's a fairly simple machine, all these ninja stars or these circles on it with all the spikes coming off them that depending on the depth you set, once you run it, they'll scoop up a bit of soil and dislodge and uproot weeds. And in a lot of crops that you can seed them just deep enough to avoid the tines on it, you can run right over the crop plants and the weeds, and you're getting the weeds controlled both between the crop rows and within the crop rows here as well with this. And so it's a pretty interesting implement, and I just want to quickly show a very short video here because this is the min-till one that's designed to work even in no-till farming, which traditionally you wouldn't be able to use something like this.
Rotary hoes were once common implements used by corn and soybean growers in the Midwest US for weed control before they had herbicides. Even though they're an old technology, rotary hoes can still effectively control many small broadleaf weeds by flicking them out of the ground with their spinning tines. They work best after the weeds have just emerged and are still in the white thread stage.
That's key.
Between this stage and the cotyledon stage, the roots aren't anchoring the plant enough to resist the whirling tines. This here is a min-till rotary hoe, and the difference is that these have two separate tines so that they don't plug up with crop residue. So they can go through a no-till field, doing a great job killing weeds. So what this narrow time window means is that you have to cover a lot of acres with a rotary hoe in a real hurry.
So you get the gist, and you can go fast. The video ends with Buddy flying across the field with stuff flying everywhere behind him. But you can run a rotary hoe in some cases as fast as the tractor will go. So you cover a lot of ground very quickly. Okay. Now a tool that is similar to blind cultivation, but obviously isn't cultivation, which is one of my favorite approaches to weed management, is propane flame weeding. I'm not sure if anybody's doing much of that. It's stronger on dicots than it is on grasses, but a very interesting approach to dealing with weeds. And if you really don't like weeds, what could be more fun than burning them as you're running through your field? So very interesting technology. And so I've included this slide here. This fella here, Stephen Nazevic, he's sort of one of the leaders in the use of flame weeding for various weeds and in various crops. And this document's a very good starting point because they provide information on how to make your own flame weeder, because the flame weeding is something that has really not hit that level where there's not, I don't think, at least locally, you could go to Green Diamond or Case or something and ask for the latest commercial flame weeder. I'm not so sure that that's possible. And most folks that use them do tend to build their own from readily available parts. And you can get some tips on how to do that in that document there. Okay, now just two other things I wanted to mention that are becoming a bit popular with mechanical control. This is a very simple weed puller that was developed in the US. I don't
A
know
series of wheels, which are driven.
if any folks are familiar with this one, but you just run this through your field. The wheels are spinning and they uproot and pull weeds out if the weeds have gotten ahead of your crop and have overtopped it. Many folks are probably realizing the obvious drawback to this machine is that if you're pulling weeds that are that large out of the ground and they're just laying in the field, most of them are still going to produce seeds. And so I wanted to show this because I think it's a neat machine. But if your weeds are big enough, if you just pull them out and leave them on the ground, you might as well have just left them in place in a lot of cases. Okay. And then probably one of the most interesting sort of new techniques that's available for weed control, and this is to the point where you can buy commercial models and stuff, is the concept of electric weeding, which is very, very interesting. And so you're basically weed wiping with electricity with these machines, and they're designed to get weeds that are obviously sticking up above the crop plants. But this absolutely fries wheat. So you're not going to see it in this picture because it takes a day or two to kick in. But every weed that's being hit by these bars, it's green when they hit it. Within a day, from the tip of the shoot all the way to soil level, is black as long as you've done it right. And so you get complete kill of all the above ground growth of a weed. And from the limited, some of the research that's been done, it really reduces seed production. And so to kind of think back to the earlier sort of slide I had where folks were hand weeding the carrots and stuff, this machine here and machines like it are probably one of the most important new technologies that will sort of reduce or eliminate sort of that need for hand weeding as that last ditch resort for those types of weed escapes, because these machines will provide almost an equivalent level of control because they're just so effective when used properly. Okay. This was a demo version that myself and Travis Esau at Dow kind of played with a couple of years ago. And this was a carrot grower who was weed wiping goldenrod here. Travis took it out to him and to try it in his carrot field. And once he started using it, he asked to have it back for almost the rest of the time we had it, to be honest. But you can see in the background, this was the goldenrod that was hit a day or two before he started up again on this part of the field. So it just gives you a sense of just how fast it kills the weeds back there. So they're a pretty neat implement. Okay. And there are other things. There's laser weeders that shoot lasers at weeds as it drives over them, but those things are north of $2 million. And so, some of the things I just showed are some of the newer things that, I think are interesting, but also have some actual practicality in terms of use in the local region. Now, with cultural control, I always get a kick out of every year when I try to talk about this concept in a weeds class. Some of the students that are from farms that are from somewhat familiar with this idea, their first response usually is, "Oh, these are all the things that don't work when it comes to controlling weeds." Um, and they got a point. Uh, Cultural weed management is not known for its whopping, immediate effects on weed populations. But if you're considering, effective durability, reliability of a weed control program, you got to kind of at least touch on this idea. And my opinion, the gist of what cultural weed management is simply designing crop populations and cropping systems so that the system itself naturally reduces the number of weeds that are left over and need to be controlled by hand weeding, physical, mechanical, and chemical control. So you're milking the crop population and your cropping system for all the natural weed control it can give you, and then you're just coming in after the fact and cleaning up the survivors that get through that. Okay, now within any given crop that's being grown, every single crop will have its own unique characteristics that can be taken advantage of from a cultural weed management perspective. Okay, and it's impossible. I don't even know for 90% of the crops being grown around the world what the hell you can do. But what I want to talk about, there's four main sort of broad categories that apply across the board, no matter what you're growing. And I'm not going to get into all four of these, but what I wanted to touch on today is the idea of shading by crop canopies and why that, although not bulletproof, a little bit of the science behind why that actually can be a very useful and sort of free form of weed management if you can take advantage of it. Okay, because the shade from any canopy, whether it be a crop canopy, a weed canopy, or from a tree in a forest, has pretty dramatic effects on other plants that are growing beneath that canopy. Um, and if you're in a cropping situation and your crop plants are the dominant canopy, and the only light or most of the light that's getting through to the ground is light that's kind of been filtered through that canopy, that does have a pretty strong effect on limiting growth and establishment of a lot of weeds. And it's because you get some pretty distinct changes in both the quantity or energy content of light, as well as the quality or wavelength composition of light when it passes through plant material. Okay, so this graph here, don't worry about the units or anything like that, but we're kind of in sort of the plant responsive wavelengths here. So sort of 300 to 800 nanometers. The y-axis is just the energy content in that light. It's the simplest way to think of that. So don't worry about the units. And then this top dark black line, this is what pure unfiltered daylight looks like. So if you walk outside on a sunny day and you feel the warmth of the sun on your face, you could turn that into a graph. This is what it would look like, at least across this portion of the electromagnetic spectrum, would be what this black line looks like. And then these other two lines, the gray one and the dashed line, this is how that line changes once that light signal passes through one leaf and then passes through two leaves. And there's two key changes that are very important for how this can affect weeds if it's your crop leaves that light is passing through. So first and foremost, the quantity aspect. Pure daylight runs at around 1500 micromole per meter square per second. Think of that as the maximum amount of energy that light can carry to drive things like photosynthesis, for example. Once that light passes through one leaf, note that over 95, 99% of that energy is used up by the first leaf that gets it. And so the next leaf in line gets much less energy out of that light to drive things like photosynthesis, and it just keeps dropping. And then the other important characteristic of how light changes as it passes through foliage or leaves or whatever is the quality aspect, and that's the wavelength composition, and in particular, the ratio of red to far red light that's in that sort of light signal. For whatever reason, I don't know the evolutionary history of it, but all plants on Earth have evolved mechanisms to detect this ratio of red to far red light in a light signal that's either hitting a leaf or hitting a seed. There's a pigment called phytochrome, changes conformation based on the color spectrum of the light that's hitting it. And so when a seed or a plant is getting hit by a light signal that has a high red to far red ratio, that seed or that plant knows that that light is coming directly from the sun. There's no other plant growing above me, so I can either grow normally or I can germinate if I'm a seed. If that plant or that seed is getting hit by light that has a low red to far red ratio, the only explanation for that low red to far red ratio in a natural ecosystem is that the light signal has already passed through the canopy of another plant. There's no other thing in nature that can really mimic that red to far red ratio other than the light already passing through or reflecting off of another plant. Hey, so if it's a growing plant, picks up on that low red to far red ratio, they'll do things like shade avoidance to try to grow taller. But seeds will use this red to far red ratio as one of many important signals to decide whether or not they're going to germinate and try to become an established seedling. Okay, so here's just some seeds exposed to some different light treatments. You can see these ones exposed to a light bulb that gives them a high red to far red ratio. You can see most of the seeds are sprouting. Seeds grown in the dark with no light, most of them are not sprouting. And then seeds that are given light, but they're given light with a low red to far red ratio. Note that the germination rate is very similar to not being exposed to any light at all. Okay. These are just lettuce seeds. It's hard to get examples purely with weeds because you got to crack dormancy and all that stuff. But this applies, for the most part across the board to all seeds, particularly seeds of weeds, because most of the plants that we deal with as weeds in typical cropping systems, they've evolved as early successional species whose sole purpose in life ever is to immediately occupy bare soil and completely cover it so that it doesn't erode away. Their job is to absorb as many nutrients as possible so that those nutrients don't leach out of the system, and they will be there to support the next wave of plants that come and so on. And these weeds are very good at doing that, and that's partly why they're weeds when you're trying to practice agriculture. But one of the most reliable signals that tells seeds in the seed bank that the plants growing above ground are now gone and there's been a disturbance is that all of a sudden you get a surge of high red to far red light, and you can only get that if there's no plants growing above ground, right? And so this signal can have quite a profound effect on weed seed germination. Long story short here. And so this is just an example in a wheat crop. This is the lower image is leaf area index, so the ratio of green leaf area to brown soil area based on days after crop emergence. And then this is your red to far red ratio on the bare soil at that site, and then underneath the wheat canopy here. And you can see it bounces around a bit because of wind and sun flex and things like that, but it's generally decreasing. And then this is germination rate of some weed seeds that were put underneath that wheat canopy or out on bare soil. And so you got a mustard species, a catchfly, lamb's quarters, and then a pigweed here. And note that although when the weed seeds were under the crop canopy, note that seed germination wasn't completely inhibited, but it was reduced in some cases quite significantly. And the mechanism there is that low red to far red ratio. The reason why it's not perfect is because of the fact that even if you have good ground cover, windy days is going to blow your canopy around. Some sunlight's still going to get through and potentially stimulate germination. But it can have a significant effect on reducing the amount of weeds that try to emerge and that try to grow and potentially compete with your crop. Okay, so one of the fundamental aspects of cultural weed management is just to create a crop population that will have minimum time to full canopy. And I'm not going to stand here and preach to you how the hell to do that because I don't have a clue for half the crops that are grown. You guys grow the crops that you grow. You're the expert at growing them. You would be the best people to know, how to do that for a particular crop that you're growing or whatever. But the idea is, as long as you can see bare soil and that bare soil is getting sunlight on it, you're going to get weeds trying to grow on that. It doesn't matter as long as you get moisture, at least the weeds are going to try to keep coming. But as that canopy closes, it starts to form this sort of force field over that soil surface that will progressively reduce the amount of weed seeds that try to germinate and that try to become established as weeds in your crop. Okay. Some things I want to mention with this. So the way you would do this for a lot of cases, it would be the old standard, higher seeding rates, narrower rows, that kind of stuff that most folks are familiar with. But I just wanted to remind folks of a couple other things associated with this that can get forgotten about by times. And the first one is that not every crop variety or cultivar or hybrid has equal capability to compete with weeds. And although it can be hard to find this information and it may be of low priority because you're obviously going to choose a variety that's going to give you the harvested material that you want. But just be aware that as you move from, say, one corn plant to another in terms of different varieties, cultivars, hybrids, I use these terms interchangeably, even though I know it's wrong. You get some pretty dramatic changes in their ability to compete with wheat. And so if you look at this example here, you can see there's this Rocker and this Cahill variety that are being compared across sites and years here. And just note that this Rocker variety is consistently taller than the other variety. It generally has higher leaf area index, so a higher ratio of green leaf area to brown soil area, and is generally intercepting much more incoming photosynthetically active radiation than the other variety. And the more of that incoming light it intercepts, the more filtered low red to far red ratio light that's being cast onto the soil below the crop. And if you look here for the weed that these folks were studying in this work, this grass species here, millet, note that even in the absence of a herbicide, your weed growth is already reduced by a little over 50% just by the difference in competitive ability between those two cultivars. Okay, so even though you may not have that information right at hand, it there can be some dramatic differences across varieties. And if you ever get a chance to tour a variety trial or something like that at Ag Canada or with Perennia or whatever, just look at the differences in canopy architecture across varieties because it can be quite incredible by times. And you can start to see some obvious differences and sort of varieties that may or may not be more competitive against weeds. Okay. Another concept that's picking up some traction. It kind of started, probably many folks have been doing this for years, but it seemed to get sort of popular through some work in Australia where they're trying everything under the sun to deal with herbicide resistant weeds. And what they started looking at is how the effect of your row orientation will affect weed populations. And the most extreme of this is just straight comparing an east-west crop planting, so having your rows planted east to west orientation versus a north-south. And this image here is taken sort of right around sort of high noon or whatever. And you can see in the east-west planting, there's much more shadow cast in that row relative to the north-south planting. The idea here being that with the east-west planting, you spend more of the day with the sun shining perpendicular to your rows as opposed to parallel to them, which means that your crops cast more shadow or more filtered light in between the rows with that orientation. Okay, and here it's a little hard to see the difference because it's a grass weed and a grass crop here, but here's the east-west versus the north-south. Some folks are finding it is actually making a difference in terms of weed populations. Now, this study looked at across all these different crops here, and if you just average it, you're getting about a 20% reduction in weed biomass when you plant east-west versus north-south. Okay, so at face value, you might be like, well, why would I do that? But the idea here is you plant east-west, say, if it's possible, if you're not on a slope or whatever, you get a 20% reduction in weed biomass. Then you narrow your rows, you get another 10% reduction in weed biomass. You increase your seeding rate, you get another 10% reduction. You use a competitive cultivar, you get another 10% reduction. And, cumulatively, before you know it, you're potentially in a situation where your herbicide or your cultivators have 50% or more or less work to do in terms of the reduction in the weeds. Okay, and here's more light interception in the east-west versus the north-south, and then higher crop yield in the east-west versus the north-south as well. Yeah. Hey, so it's just a neat idea that I thought I would kind of share as part of this cultural weed management idea. The others, again, for time, I'm already over time here. The others, I'm not going to mention anything on these in the interest of time, other than with the crop rotations. I just wanted to say that here in Atlantic Canada, many of you actually represent a textbook example of how to do things correctly. Because if you look at agriculture throughout North America, one of the most prevalent problems for weed management is the evolution of resistance to glyphosate or Roundup. And that is now permeated every single Roundup ready cropping system almost everywhere. But to the best of my knowledge, we've been relatively resilient to that happening here in Atlantic Canada. And the main reason seems to be that much of the Roundup ready corn and soybeans is often grown in rotation with forages, some other crops like alfalfa and stuff. And it's incredible how powerful that rotation effect is. And right here in Atlantic Canada, many of you are already showing the rest of the world how not to get glyphosate resistance simply by doing what you're doing. Okay. Now, lastly, some thoughts on chemical management here. Obviously, herbicides are a very useful, important, and powerful tool when it comes to dealing with weeds. And here in Atlantic Canada, across the range of crops that are grown, we have access to, quite a significant number of them, to be honest. So what I've kind of done here is just taken them and kind of clustered them into three main sort of categories here. So I have what I would consider sort of the true pre-emergence herbicides, herbicides that can be applied both pre-emergence and post-emergence and still provide weed control. And then the rest are herbicides that really only provide weed control if they're applied post-emergence to the weeds. Okay, now true pre-emergence herbicides, most of these will not kill emerged green plants because they are contact herbicides that work by inhibiting growth of plant tissues that contact the herbicide while the germinating seed or young seedling is growing through the soil. Okay, these herbicides exhibit little to no translocation in plants, and therefore, when applied to above ground plant parts, they may cause a localized reduction in growth along an edge of a leaf, but they will not provide weed control. So we're depending on getting these herbicides into the soil so that little tiny roots and shoots of developing weeds will grow into them and contact them have their growth inhibited, and then they just never come above ground and we never see them and just get on with our lives. Okay. Now, the first group here, so again, the groups here are 3, 15, and 29. So if you see those groups on a label, I'm not going to get in too much on the specific products, but if you see these numbers, then this is kind of what you can expect. That's what I kind of want to try to do here. And so group 3, that locally, the main products would be, if you're using Treflan or Prowl, would be two of the big ones. Curb also fits into this. These herbicides, with the exception of Curb, they don't tend to provide, again, any control of weeds that are emerged at application, but they will stick around and pick off weeds that try to grow after application. Now, Treflan and Prowl, you get a range of annual grass and broadleaf weed control, but generally with these products, because you're depending on a very, very small developing seedling to contact these herbicides as they grow through the soil, they tend to work best on small seeded broadleaf plants that produce small seedlings. And they tend to also be very effective on some of the grasses, because as a grass seedling develops under the soil, there's a little shield or covering over the growing point called the coleoptile. And if you inhibit growth of that, which many of these herbicides do, then the shoot can't come above ground because it's trapped in its own structure. Okay, so these products, Treflan and Prowl, they got to be out before the weeds are up, or else you'll have limited control. And if anybody uses Treflan, obviously, you got to incorporate that and stuff. It's a pretty tricky one to use. And then Curb, even though it's in the same group number, it's a little bit different because it will control established perennial weeds. So it kind of deviates from, like, normally you talk to a hardcore weed scientist, group 3, got to apply to bare soil before the weeds come up, or else you don't get any weed control. 99% of the time that's true, but Curb is an exception, because you can have established growing perennial weeds that will still be killed by that herbicide. Okay. Now, the values I've got here, this KOC value, that refers to how much a herbicide likes to stick to soil and organic matter. The higher the number, the more sticky the herbicide is to soil and organic matter. And then I've got the half-life here. So these products, they tend to have fairly long half-lives. And so with things like Treflan and Prowl, you should be able to reliably get up to 10 weeks of pre-emergence weed control, depending on the year. And the average KOC here is almost 8,000. So what that means is, with things like Treflan and Prowl, unless you have excessive rain, they should form a nice sort of herbicide barrier in the soil and stay there and continue to inhibit weed seeds that are trying to germinate close to the soil surface. Okay. Curb's a little less sticky, and it can leach a little bit more, but Treflan and Prowl really, really shouldn't. Okay. Now, group 15, these are products like Dual, Frontier, and Zidua, if anyone's using that. Almost everything about the group 15s is almost exactly analogous to the group 3. So for a lot of folks, if you're using a group 3 or a group 15, in terms of big picture, outside looking in, everything's going to play out very, very similar, with a few exceptions. Okay, so you're looking at pre-control, same thing, annual grass, small seeded annual broadleaf weeds, limited efficacy on emerge weeds. But one of the nice things about the group 15s that you don't tend to get from the group 3s is that if you pre-plant incorporate some of them, you do get suppression of yellow nut sedge, which I don't think you get with the group 3s, at least not that I'm aware of, but I'll stand to be corrected on that. And these products are not nearly as sticky in soil, so they do move a little bit, but not much compared to some other ones, and they'll kind of stay where you put them. But the residual activity is a little less compared to the group 3s, but you should still get a solid, 6 weeks of weed control from them. And when I say weed control here on any of these slides, please be reminded I'm talking about weed control of susceptible species, so not, broad spectrum. If the herbicide is labeled to kill it, it should kill it for this length of time, is what I mean here, not that it's going to kill every non-crop. Okay. And then the group 29s may be a little less common in a lot of systems, but the The two main products are Allion, which is being used a bit in some of the hort crops and stuff, and then Casseron as well. Allion, it's got a lot of weeds on the label. It's quite a broad spectrum pre-emergence herbicide. Again, it would have limited efficacy on emerged weeds. Casseron is like curb. It's an exception to most of the other molecules in its group number in that it will control established perennial weeds as well. And both of these products, particularly Allion, tend to live in the soil and remain active in the soil for quite a long time. And so you get quite a nice long period of residual weed control from these products. And based on the half-life value, you should expect easily 3 months of residual weed control, maybe longer. But again, it kind of depends on your soil type, pH, myriad of things. Okay. Okay. But here in Atlantic Canada, and not every crop will have every single one of those products, but if you have access to a group 3, 15, or 29, or any combination therein, then you have access to some very powerful tools that can lay down a very significant barrier to the germination and emergence of annual weed seedlings for a prolonged period of time throughout the crop that you're trying to grow. And so they can form a very nice foundation to an overall weed management program if you're able to utilize these true pre-products, because they can be very effective on the weeds that they get. Okay. Now, pre and post herbicides, I consider these, for the ones we have locally, to be groups 2, 4, 5, and 27. And in order for a herbicide to be able to apply before weed emergence and work, or be able to apply post-emergence and kill emerged weeds, but still provide residual activity afterwards, the herbicide has to be able to move in the xylem, or the water conducting tissue of the weeds. Okay, and so if a herbicide will simultaneously be able to provide both pre-emergence and post-emergence activity, it needs to exhibit apoplastic or xylem movement, or both apoplastic and symplastic xylem and phloem mobility in plants. Okay, in other words, it has to be able to be sucked up by the roots, move into the xylem, and move upwards from the roots into the above ground parts of the plant. If it can't do that, then it will very unlikely that it will have true pre-emergence activity. Okay, but most herbicides that fit this bill, they tend to readily absorb into both roots and foliage, and thus tend to provide both pre and post weed control. Now, the group 2s, what I would just say in general is if you see group 2 on a label, assume nothing, because the group 2s is the largest group of herbicides currently available on the market, at least as far as I know. And there's an extremely diverse range of chemistry under this broad group number. And you get a lot of molecules that behave very uniquely relative to other molecules within that same group number, because there are a range of chemical families present under this group number. But locally here in Atlantic Canada, it still seems like we're kind of relying, if a herbicide is a group 2, that we're kind of relying on the two sort of traditional chemical families of group 2s, and that's the sulfonylureas and the imidazolinones. If you see a group 2 herbicide and the active ingredient ends with uron, then chances are it's a sulfonylurea and will behave similar to the products that I'm talking about here on this slide. So classic is chlorimuron, Chicara, Flaza, sulfuron, Permit, Halo sulfuron, Steadfast, Nico sulfuron, plus Rim sulfuron, Prism. I always get it mixed up. I'm pretty sure that's Rim sulfuron. And then Spartan is tribenuron. So you kind of see the pattern there. Those types of molecules, while you will have individuals that will deviate from the overall trend, they all tend to be somewhat similar in that they will provide both pre and post control of select broadleaf grass and sedge weeds. Some of them have a very small list of weeds controlled on the label. Some of them have a relatively large list of weeds controlled. on the label. So it just depends on the product. In my opinion, most of them work best when applied post-emergence, and then you will rely on just getting a little bit of bonus weed control from the pre-emergence activity. But to me, most sulfonylureas, you kind of are aiming to target weeds that are emerged, and then you will also take advantage of a bit of residual activity afterwards. They're persistent in soil, and hence the residual activity you get is affected by soil pH. So if you're applying it to a soil with a neutral or alkaline pH, say you're applying lime, then these products should last longer because they tend to break down more rapidly in acidic soil. And so depending on your pH, that really affects the residual activity that you'll get from them. If you just look straight up at the average KOC and half-life, these herbicides are not sticky in soil, so they're readily available for weed control. And the half-life of the sulfonylureas in soil is relatively short on average, although some products do last longer than others, and I've got them ranked based on half-life. So Classic provides the longest residual control, followed by Chikara, Permit, Steadfast, Prism, and then Spartan. And again, on average with them, probably 2 to 4 weeks, but again, it will depend on the pH that you have in the soil when you apply it. Okay. The other group 2 family that I think gets used a bit in Atlantic Canada is the imidazolinones. And basically, if you look at the front page of the label, and the active ingredient ends with Aper, Amox, Apic, or Aquin, then it's probably an IMI. So you would have like imazothaper, imazamox, imazapic, imazaquin. There's a very common pattern to that. This group of group 2s is a bit different from the sulfonylureas in that I think they're a much broader spectrum of weed control. So things like Pursuit, for example, tend to control quite a significant number of weeds, and they tend to last a lot longer in the soil. They're more persistent in acidic than basic soils. So it's the opposite of the friggin' sulfonylureas. But the half-life of Pursuit is 75 days. So, say at a typical sort of neutralish pH, you're looking at potentially 10 weeks or more of residual activity. So much more reliable residual activity from a group 2 if it's an imidazolinone relative to if it's sulfonylurea. Okay, the group 4s, again, kind of like the group 2s. To me, if something says group 4 on it, first and foremost, it's only probably going to control broadleaf weeds. Just get that out of the way right away. It might still damage grasses, to be honest, but they're known mainly for killing broadleaf plants, not grasses or sedges. But again, even though I consider them both pre and post emergence herbicides, or post and pre, again, group 4s, they're known to be most effective for controlling target weeds when applied post emergence, but many of them will provide anywhere from 1 to 3, maybe 4 weeks of some residual control as well. Okay, but I think they work best post, but because you do get some residual activity out of them, I've got them lumped into this category as well. Very good soil profile. They're readily available for uptake by weeds, and their half-life is pretty short, so you don't get a ton of residual, but that also means that under normal circumstances, you don't have a lot of potential carryover to susceptible crop species. Okay. Now, probably the king of all groups of herbicides in this group here is by far the group 5s. If you have access to a group 5 herbicide in your crop you're growing, you more or less won the lottery when it comes to weed control, as long as you're not dealing with resistance, because these products like Sinbar, Carmex, Velpar, Atrazine or Atrex, Sencor, Metribuzin, Lorox, in most crops, when you put these herbicides down, you're looking at a Roundup-like situation where, in many cases, not much else gets through that situation but the crop plants. And some of them don't do that anymore by any means due to things like resistance. But these are very, very good herbicides. And If applied post-emergence to green tissue, they will burn it and kill it, and then also stick around in the soil for 10 weeks or more to provide weed control. So again, if you do have access to group 5 herbicides as part of the weed control program, again, those are the backbone of many weed control programs. And in the absence of them, especially in crops like potatoes, carrots with Sencor and Lorox, even in blueberries, a lot of folks don't like, Valpar doesn't pack the same punch that it used to, but it definitely is getting a lot of stuff that would otherwise be missed, particularly trees and stuff like that. Atrazine in corn, generally, again, without resistance, there's nothing left but corn. Um, the main concern with them is, yeah, as many folks may know, some of these can leach with heavy rainfall, and so you get reduced weed control because they move too deep in the soil. But you can also end up with potentially some issues in groundwater. Lorox and I think Sencor are probably the least sensitive to that. Belpar and Atrex a little more so than the others. Okay, but if you got a group 5, you got a pretty good little weed control tool to work with there. And here, I think I got the description of this image right. This was a neat trial that Sonny and them did with Perennia there, looking at spraying strips of herbicides and then seeding cover crops perpendicular to them. And if I remember right, this landing strip right through the middle is where Sinbar was applied in the spring, and then these crops are planted in the fall. And so you get a sense of just the sheer amount of residual activity you can potentially get from some of these products. And then the last group here is the 27s. Locally, I think that's mainly Callisto would be the main product that folks are familiar with. But I think there's a fair amount of Acuron that goes out, which contains I think it's 4 active ingredients and 3 group numbers, but there are a couple of group 27s in it. And so the information up here is strictly for the group 27s. And so again, pre and post control of various weeds. The Callisto label is not extensive, but it does control more weeds than are listed on the label. Residual activity is not huge, but you should be able to get a month or two, a couple of, sort of a month out of them pretty easily. And then if you are able to use a group 27 with a group 5, then that combination of products is very synergistic and can dramatically improve your overall weed control, which is one of the reasons why, Acuron has 2 group 27s and a group 5, as well as a 15 in there, because you're getting the atrazine working synergistically with the mesotrione and the other bicyclopyrin in there. Very, very good weed control if you can combine those 2 group numbers. Okay. And then lastly, you got the true post herbicides, and they have limited soil activity because they're too sticky, they break down too fast, or they just don't translocate well enough in the xylem to get to the above ground part of plants. Okay. Now, the first group here, the group 1s, many folks are familiar with these. These are the grass killers. And so if you have access to 1 or more of these products, then you can, without resistance, you can kill almost any grass in any broadleaf crop, perennial or annual, but they don't affect any broadleaf weeds. And residual activity is very, very limited, but it is not zero, surprisingly. So I will state these herbicides generally provide weed control only when applied post-emergence. But some of them do actually provide a little bit of residual control. So you can get a little bit of extended grass control from some of these products because of that residual activity. And we can talk more about that in questions or whatever. But generally post only, but you can get a surprisingly little bit of residual activity from some of them. Okay. The group 6s, Pardner, Bassagran, Tough. I'm not sure if that's used very much yet, but Pyridate there. These are mainly post control of a range of broadleaf weeds, top kill of perennial broadleaf weeds, limited efficacy on grasses. I've kind of got the values here for both Pardner and Bassagran. So if you kind of look at Pardner, the active in that, its KOC value is 10,000. That's a very high number. and the half-life is 7 days. So Pardner really shouldn't provide any residual activity whatsoever. But Basagran, I'm not going to say it does, but its soil profile would suggest that Basagran would provide some level of residual control because it's not sticky and its half-life is long enough that you could probably get a couple of weeks of potential residual activity, as long as it will translocate above ground from the roots. Okay. Now, 9 and 10, I just got these together. This is Roundup and Ignite, or glyphosate and glufosinate. I got them together mainly because in an annual cropping system where you're trying to control annual weeds, these two products, in my opinion, are almost interchangeable. So in the absence of perennial weeds like dandelion, if you grew Roundup ready, say corn 1 year, and then a glyphosate or Ignite tolerant crop the next year, like Liberty Link or something, I honestly don't think you'd notice that much difference in your overall weed control. Okay, Ignite is weaker on perennial weeds, and it is less forgiving as weeds get bigger. But in a lot of the transgenic cropping systems, you can sort of mix and match the Ignite or Liberty tolerant crops and the Roundup tolerant crops, and without any sacrifice in weed control, with the exception of the fact that Ignite is much weaker on perennial weeds. And these numbers are why these products don't have any soil activity. Roundup or glyphosate is very tightly bound to soil particles and has very little, if any, soil activity because it's just trapped against the soil particles too tightly. And Ignite just simply breaks down too fast to have any residual activity. Okay. And then the 22s, this is Gramoxone and Reglone. These are some older products. I don't know how much Gramoxone is used anymore, but Reglone, has traditionally been a potato top killer, used as a harvest aid and so on. These products are broad spectrum, kill everything that's green, or at least damage anything that's green. There are no outside of resistance. There are no naturally tolerant crops or weeds to these. And you can see why they're post only here. The KOC, this million, that might as well be that infinity symbol here. This means that these molecules are infinitely stuck to soil particles. And you can see when they get into soil, their half-life is 1,000 days because they're held so tightly that they don't break down because they're trapped against the soil particles. Okay, now the only group that I didn't touch on, and I really can't believe how long I'm going here, I do apologize, are the group 14s, and that's because this group gets more complex every year that new molecules are added. And some of the group 14s are kind of have the pre-post activity, and some of them are now what I would consider sort of true post herbicides as well. So they straddle across multiple categories. So that's why I kind of left them to last. If you're using Authority, Reflex, Dole, Aragon, Chateau, these products should provide contact, sort of burn down activity on emerge broadleaf weeds. So if you have a green broadleaf, and at least if it's sensitive to the herbicides, they should turn brown and die back when you apply the product. And most of these will also provide varying levels of residual control as well, but it is highly variable across products. Group 14s are one of the most variable groups of herbicides now, it seems, in terms of their residual activity, pre-post activity, and so on. The average half-life is 58 days, but some of these are significantly longer than that. Some of them are significantly shorter than that. Authority is the most persistent. Chateau is the least persistent, based purely on half-life values. And so you can use that as a guide just to indicate, how long your residual activity would actually be. Okay. And then AIM, carfentrazone, and then Insight, which is a relatively new product, tiafenisol, if anyone's using that in grapes. These are group 14s as well, but they are purely post-emergence herbicides because of the fact that they break down in less than a day in soil, so their half-life is less than a day. And so they don't have any soil activity. Hey, So I am done. Shut me down, Hugh.
You can have another next an hour if you want. No,
No,
thank you
I'm
very
good.
much, Scott. This is awesome. We don't want to shut it down because I think this is very valuable to get recorded for people to review or come back again. I'm not going to say too much, and thank you for all the things you say today. And yeah, thank you. Everyone, we still have Sunny is going to talk about a few examples of a management program, and I think we can, since we are late, might as well we can finish this, and then if you guys need it, come back to review this video in March. Yeah, Sunny.
Hi, Hugh. Hopefully you can hear me.
Yep.
All right, I'll just share my presentation here. Just while I'm queuing that up, I'd like to thank Scott again. That was awesome. Great review. Covered a lot of ground in a short amount of time, so really appreciate that.
We can see your slides. It's in the, yeah, all good now.
All right, just got to get back into it. So what I was asked to talk about today was just how to put a weed management program or spray program together. My talk is going to be heavy on the chemical side. So Scott kind of went over, what tools or what cards we have to work with. I'm going to talk about how to put those into a program so you can try to achieve weed control through a whole year. My talk's going to be a little bit heavier on perennial systems, but I will touch on annual systems towards the end. So hopefully this takes about 20 minutes. If you got to go, you can catch this on the recording. Certainly understand I got big shoulders. You won't. I won't take it offensively if you have to leave for sure. So when you're putting a plan together, I think it's really important to do that in the off season. So many growers that I work with and calls that I go to, people are trying a new crop or they call me in after there's a problem and there's really not a lot we can do, right? We got to catch these weeds when they're young. We have pre-emergent products to work with in a lot of cases. And in a lot of cases, the products we have to work with, there's not a lot of them. So it's very important to have a plan going into the season and then just through the season, work that plan, revisit the plan, and adapt as things change. So here's some cool quotes that I heard recently that I thought were very pertinent to this. And I wish I could do an impression of these guys, but I can't. It'd be a lot more entertaining. Mike Tyson once said, everybody's got a plan until they get punched in the face, right? So the way I took that is, okay, we have a plan, but we better have a plan B, right? But what Mike Tyson was trying to say here was strike first, right? And I think that applies to weed control as well, right? We don't want those weeds to get the upper hand on us, and then all of a sudden we're behind the 8 ball working with the large weeds after they've already competed with the crop. So obviously I'm not a very good fighter because I took it as you got to have a plan B. Winston Churchill once said, plans are of little importance, but planning is essential. So as you're going through this planning process, the product at the end of the day may not be as important as going through that planning process, knowing what the options are if things go wrong in season, and that gives you a chance to adapt, go a different direction, get a different product on, or take a different approach, right? So what I wanted to talk about first off is perennial crops. This is kind of where I work a lot in now, and these are things like apple orchard, raspberries, high bush blueberries, strawberries, which are a short-term perennial crop if there's such a thing. But it's not so much important what crop we're working in as some of the things that we want to think about as we're putting this plan together. So first thing I want to think about, in a perennial crop, what weed species are going to be the worst, right? So perennial crop, we don't have tillage or we have very limited tillage. So generally we're going to have perennial weeds, right, as our biggest problem. And I think it's important that growers keep an inventory of weeds that are a problem that they see and keep another list of weeds that are not well controlled in the system the way it is now, right? So these weeds that are poorly controlled with the products you're using over time are going to build up in population, right? And Scott mentioned this, right? Those weeds are going to get through your weed control program, go to seed, proliferate. Years down the road, they're going to be worse and worse, right? It's not that your weed program isn't working, but maybe we need to shift it a little bit to take care of those problematic weeds. The only way you're going to do that is to keep an inventory of weeds that somehow avoid your weed control system. So in a perennial system, when we're in those establishment years, we really have to take an approach that we control those perennial weeds ahead of time before we have that perennial crop planted, right? So we have to start a year or a year and a half ahead of time, and we can use anything we want to control those perennial weeds and get control of them so that we don't have established perennial weeds when we have that crop in there. Once we have that crop in there, especially in those establishment years, we don't have a lot of weed control options. Those perennial crops are very tender with a lot of new growth on them. They're not well established. They don't compete against weeds through those stages also. So we need to make sure that we get the upper hand on those perennial weeds beforehand. And we can do that through introducing tillage into that system. We can use herbicides like glyphosate. We can use something to smother those weeds, either a cover crop, or we can use tarps on a smaller scale, that kind of thing. We can use a allelopathic crop, something like a rye grain, plant it very thick. It can take care of those perennial weed problems, something like a sorghum Sudan grass or a marigold. So we want to use a variety of things that we have at our disposal, and we're not limited because we don't have our perennial crop there yet. So, and then I like to put out, what is our goal? Oftentimes we get so lost in our everyday farming life that we lose sight of our goal. So our goal in the system is to maintain, an 18-inch strip, generally weed-free on each side of the crop that we're planting. So, that's the same goal whether you're planting grapes, vineyard, or high bush blueberries. You look at an apple orchard, maybe your herbicide strip is a little bit wider, but your goal is the same, right? And we want to maintain that generally through the year, right? So we don't necessarily want those weeds to go to seed for us, because there'll be more and more of a problem next year through that harvest period. A lot of times it can interfere with mechanical harvesting, or even picking up drops in apples, or it can even harbor pests like spotted wing disopter. Really likes that high humidity and low wind current through that weed canopy. So in a lot of these perennial crops, we want to maintain that weed-free crop right through the growing season. So Scott went over this, so I won't dwell a lot of time on it. The way I look at things is, and this is the same for a lot of perennial crops, we have 4 main categories of herbicides. So we got post-emergent. Just have to move things here a little bit so we can see what I'm talking about. We got post-emergent products that are a broad spectrum with no residual. These include your Roundups, your Mad Dogs, your Credit, glyphosates of any flavor, your Ignite, AIM, and there's a couple organic type products in there like vinegar and BioLink. The next category is a pre-emergent residual that control both grasses and broadleaf weeds. So these are herbicides that we want to get on ahead of weed emergence. If there's a few weeds up, we can still put these on, but it's not going to control those weeds that are emerged. If there's too many weeds up, we don't get good control with these products because we don't have that coverage over the soil surface. So that is very important with these type of products, that we have an even coverage on the soil surface, that we can produce that barrier. Down in the corner here, we got post-emergent, no residual products that will control grasses. And Scott did a great job of reviewing these. Products like Post Ultra, Venture, Assure, Select is also in that category. And then that leaves us with post-emergent and residual products with a limited grass and a broadleaf residual. These are things like a Prism and others. So anytime you want to look and see what's registered on your crop, you can go on the Perennia Pest Guide site, and they do a very good job of reviewing all the products that are available, and pointing out some of the restrictions or things you want to think about when you're applying particular products. So that does a good job of listing all the products that are available. But how do we then take that and put that into a program that we can use on our farm? So what I've thrown up on the screen here is it's just a sample program that I put together somewhere along the line for a vineyard. And this is a very interesting vineyard because they have winter hilling in there. So it's a perennial crop, but it still has a little bit of soil disturbance in there. So, okay, so we're going to have both perennial weeds as a problem and annual weeds. So that introduction of the limited tillage in there changes how you would put this program together, right? In most perennial crops, we don't have any tillage going on, but these guys are doing 2 tillage passes a year. They're putting soil on to put that hill on for winter protection, to protect that crown area, and then they're taking it off. So that is happening quite late in the year and then quite early in the spring. So this isn't enough tillage that will control perennial weeds, but it's enough tillage to get annual weeds started. So you kind of have the worst of both cases, right? You're going to have problems here with annual weeds and perennial weeds. So the other thing you want to keep in mind is, is that tillage introducing your residual herbicide to the root zone of the crop, right? So there's a little bit of opportunity for herbicide injury here if we get carried away and mix that residual herbicide too deep at too high of a concentration, right? So we got to keep that in the back of our mind as we're putting this whole program together. So the other things that I'd like to include in the program, the timing is very important. So when these products go on, but it also it triggers you to go have a look at the crop at these different times and say to yourself, okay, we're at post fruit set, weed control is looking good. What's the weather doing? Yeah, okay, I need to put this on, and I should be safe. Or you could be in a year where you go out post fruit set, it's been raining all the time, we've had excessive rain. As Scott said, the weeds just keep germinating. Oh gosh, I'm in a bit of a trouble here. Do I need to do something else, right? So having that timing there tells you when you're going to apply the product, perhaps, but it also triggers you to go look and make a management decision. And I think that is as crucial a part of it as the application itself. So of course, you're going to have the product and the rate. The re-entry period is becoming more and more important as we tune into workers and labor, and when we can send those guys in, when we need to keep them out and find them something else to do. So I think that's a great thing to include on your herbicide plan, because when you're in season, you get all these things coming at you. Do you really have time to go search the label for these things? It's important to keep that in your mind, so it's at your fingertips, so you know where to send the workers in season. The herbicide group that Scott mentioned, I think it's important to put those there so that we can see that we're keeping up the proper rotation through the year, that we're not overusing one particular herbicide group and selecting for resistance. So if we got a good mix, we know that we're doing our part for herbicide resistance, and we shouldn't be selecting for any one particular weed species to come through the program, right? And the pre-harvest interval, of course, is always important for food safety. So when I'm putting the program together, I like to look at all those things just so I have them in front of me and I know where they'll be when I'm in the heat of the battle of the season, right? So, okay, so let's come back to products. So the first thing we're going to do is hill removal. We're going to do that very early in the spring, right? So that's going to peel the soil off and give us some disturbance. Before we put on a residual product, you know, I want to wait till that soil settles a little bit so we can maintain that barrier and get a good coverage on that barrier. If we put it on the day after, then the soil settles a little bit. You know, we have cracks in that barrier and weeds could escape. Because we have disturbance, you know, I think we want to come in with a good residual at the first crack because those annual weeds are going to emerge in the spring. And there could be a lot of them again because we have that soil disturbance. So what I'm going to do, according to this plan, is come in with AIM with Allian. Scott mentioned that Allian's has a very long residual control, so that's going to carry me through quite a ways into the summer. I want to include AIM, which is a group 14, but it's one of those weird group 14s that doesn't have a lot of residual to it. It's mainly a burn down product. The reason I've chose AIM to go in the spring is because there could be weeds there that have emerged already. I want to burn them off. They're trying to establish. They're quite young this early in the spring. AIM is more forgiving if the weather is cold and dark compared to Ignite. So I'm going to use AIM up front. The other thing is with Ignite, I'm limited to only 2 applications per year in most crops, right? So I don't want to use one of them in the spring where it's not quite as effective when I know that I'm going to use it later. And I want to keep one in my back pocket in case this whole plan, you know, doesn't work. I want to hold on to one, right? So AIM, the reason why I don't use it through the season is because I'm only allowed 1 application a year in many crops and because it's a little bit weak on grasses, right? So we shouldn't have a whole lot of grasses emerged in the spring at this time unless it's a perennial grass, and I should have taken care of that perennial grass last fall. So that's how the whole thing is kind of coming together. So I'm going to use a burn down product for any weeds that are emerged. I got Allian there as a nice residual control. So fast forward a little bit, I have that applied. It's doing a great job. I come up to a fruit set, you know, now we're, you know, 6 weeks later. Do I have a few weeds that are starting to break through, right? I'm going to go out and look. And what I like to do is get a little bit of a more residual on to carry me through that harvest period, right? So I'm going to top up the residual that I have there. So on post fruit set, I want something that's going to take me through that harvest period. So I could include an authority if I chose to do so. And with authority, I'm going to mix in the Ignite. So again, these products, because I have that Ignite in there, I have to ban them, make sure I'm not getting too much drift onto the crop. I want to minimize the amount of drift that I'm getting onto the bark so I don't injure that bark either, right? So keep that in mind. So now I've laid down another residual product that really should carry me through to the fall. I have to be very careful that I get a residual on there because oftentimes the growers will get busy through that harvest period. They'll neglect the weed control, and what'll happen is weeds will take off, especially on those later varieties, and then they will interfere with harvest equipment, right? We see that a lot, particularly on high bush blueberries. And once they start messing with the harvest equipment, I get more junk in my product that I have to clean out as it's going through the grading lines. The guy that's looking after the grading line is on me because his costs are up, right? He's got to run his line slower to sort this stuff out, and the quality of the product goes down, right? So fast forward a little more. You know, I have the option if the weeds are there to put Prism on, and it has a very lengthy pre-harvest interval that we have to watch of 21 days. So what a lot of guys will do is they'll, okay, my projected harvest date is this, back up 21 days, and then I have to make a decision whether I'm going to make my application or not, right? So if there's any weeds there, okay, these are going to get nasty by the time I get through harvest. Maybe I have to make that decision to make that application. Things are looking good. I'm going to not put it on at all, right? So as Scott said, Prism, yeah, it's got a post-emergent activity and a very short residual activity. So the other reason I put Prism in there at the end was because late in the fall, I have to do that hilling where I have the opportunity to mix that soil. Some of that may get into the root zone and cause injury as well. So I'm going to put a very short residual product on at the end of the day if I need to. So in perennial crops, I think the last opportunity that we have is looking at a post-harvest cleanup. And a lot of guys don't do this. But I think it's a real opportunity missed by many growers. If you're battling perennial weeds, the best time to control them is in the fall when you have that translocation down to the root. We can put a Roundup on at that time. We have to be careful, of course, to band it and not get it onto the crop. And often growers are putting this on at a time where the leaves are already off the crop and the crop is dormant, but the weeds underneath are still growing and susceptible to that Roundup application. So I think that's a really important application. A lot of your winter annual weeds germinate in the fall. A lot of your perennials established during that fall period. And then by the time you get back in there in the spring, they can be quite large and overtaking you. So I know growers, you know, after harvest, they're ready to pack it in, but I think that Roundup glyphosate application in the fall is very important, and it'll give you a leg up in the spring, making your spring much more manageable. So, you know, we can use a similar program in high bush blueberries. I won't delay on it. The difference that I made is that fall application, right? So we have the opportunity to, again, use that glyphosate late fall, clean up the perennial and winter annual weeds that are there, but we can also put a residual product in that'll last into the spring. The reason why I didn't do it in this sample vineyard was because we do the soil disturbance after the Roundup application, right? So that'll break that, again, that soil barrier, and again, mix that residual herbicide perhaps in with the root zone, and we don't want to see that. So in the vineyard, we didn't put it on. In the high bush blueberry, we tend to put it on, again, because we don't have that soil disturbance. Anyway, I think that's all I wanted to cover there. So we can do a similar thing with strawberries. This is just a sample strawberry program. What I did in this program was I listed all the options and broke them down by when you could apply them through the development period of that crop. So we have early spring, pre-bloom, renovation, soon after renovation, late summer, late fall. So I just listed all the options and when we can put them on. And then I chose which herbicide I felt would give us the best weed control based on the weeds that are present and tend to be troublesome for strawberry growers. So here, early spring, I can put any one of these products on. I picked Sinbar, and this is the expected weed control that I can get from that Sinbar application. And then I just went through that for the whole season. Okay, so at renovation is my next opportunity. I could put a Lawn Trail on. I picked Lawn Trail over 2,4-D because it's much better on vetch. You know, and I know that it's much better on sheep sorrel as well. So I went with the product that would give me the best control for the weeds that I know have historically been a problem in that field. So, and again, you know, this is just a plan, and plans change, but at least I know I have the option to put them on through the season. So how do I know which herbicide controls which weeds? For that, we need to consult the efficacy table. This one is for strawberries. We're lucky enough that in New Brunswick, Gavin Graham put this together. It's an excellent publication on strawberry herbicides. Anybody growing strawberries should have this publication. So that just leaves me to cover annual crops, and Scott did a great job covering that. So I'm not going to dwell a lot of time on it. But one thing I think you should think about is, you know, how long is that critical weed-free period, right? So when I work in field crops, in the past, what I typically saw was growers were too slow to get in there. So they're putting a residual product on at the later part of that critical weed-free period. And, you know, anybody that grows a field crop, you know, the problem with it is that is not their main source of income. They're busy feeding cows or chickens or that kind of thing. And the field crop almost becomes secondary. So by the time they get out there, usually they're halfway through that critical weed control period. So they've already lost yield, and they're spending money on the herbicide besides, and they're kind of coming in at the backside of that critical weed-free period. So on soybeans, that critical weed-free period, you know, I estimate it to be at about 21 days. So, you know, is an application of Roundup going to do that for you? So I think most growers should be coming in, you know, pre-plant or pre-emergent with a residual product that's going to last into that soybean crop, and then come in with Roundup or something as a last resort. And that could be mixed in with your fungicide if you're doing that kind of a program. Same thing with corn. You know, corn has an even longer critical weed-free period. You know, a lot of guys are coming in when that corn is already in the fourth 5-leaf, laying down Roundup plus a residual product. You know, you've already suffered a little bit of yield loss, and you spent the money on the residual. If you backed it up, you know, a couple weeks, I think you're already using a great program, and just your timing is a little bit off. Anyway, I'll get off my soapbox. That's really all I wanted to say with an annual crop is I think you need to rely on a pre-emergent product and then have a post-emergent product as a plan B. Anyway, if there's any questions at all, happy to take them. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Hugh.